The views expressed in this program do not necessarily reflect those of this station.
Welcome to Insights into Northeast Michigan, a WBKB News public affairs program. Insights deals with the issues affecting those in the community, as well as Northeast Michigan and the state. And now, Insights into Northeast Michigan.
Good morning, and thanks for joining us to another edition of Insights. I'm joined by ACC Professor of Political Science, Tim Kuhnlein. And Tim, thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
And so we're kind of getting away from the election now, but one of the biggest talking points was how divided America was, or how it seemed to be. And so can you touch a little bit about this divided America concept?
Yeah, it's nothing really new. I mean, the election actually captures how immediate the statistics are and how it's playing itself out politically. But we've known for quite a while that the United States has been struggling with divisions on a whole bunch of dimensions. And there are a lot of studies coming out now, particularly post-election, that raised awareness about this, and it's interesting. For example, 8 in 10, according to one study, it's a CNN ORC, which is a market research firm titled Engine Group out of Princeton. They say 8 out of 10 people are dissatisfied with democracy as we know it. This goes back to a previous discussion that we've had. And actually 8 out of 10 people really want sort of a bipartisan solution. And I think this just speaks to this whole issue of what this election represents. Yes, we're divided, but what does that mean? And what do people want out of this? And while many believe that this election was a landslide or this or that, the reality is 8 out of 10 people want some sort of middle ground here. And less than 40% believe that Trump had a mandate out of this election. I think that's pretty clear when you look at the statistics that this was a very close election. And 53% want outreach by Trump and the Republican Party to new supporters. In other words, people that didn't necessarily vote for him, but he and the Republicans gained the ground that they have at the federal level.
So kind of speak to people that didn't support him in the first place.
There's actually an earnest, 53% that are saying they want this outreach to inclusion. And I think Trump is beginning to at least use that language.
And so this division, as it seems, it's always people say I don't like this about this person, or I don't like this about this candidate. But what do you think these people are actually want to see? Or like, what are these 8 out of 10 people are expecting?
It's a good question. Well, first of all, the people who are most dissatisfied, that's interesting. 60% white evangelicals, 62% of rural America, 62% of whites without college degrees. And the areas where people are most upset and want action, whether it's partisan or bipartisan, are unemployment, immigration, terrorism, poverty, and inequality. So unemployment, immigration, terrorism, poverty, and inequality. And these are kind of universal because we're issues that people are concerned with. Because we're seeing these same statistics play out even more exaggerated form on the world scale in other Western democracies or democratic republics. Where our statistic of America being on the wrong track is 63% of Americans believe we're on the wrong track. In France, 89% of Frenchmen believe that France is on the wrong track. And it's these issues that are really catapulting the discussion. There's also an interesting parallel historically. I mean, when you look back at the 1870s, 1880s, 90s, and into the first couple of decades of the 20th century, when we had equally as significant discrepancies of wealth, we had a populist movement, a populist reaction. There was the progressive movement, but then there was the populist movement. The progressive movement was more urban, more middle class. The populist movement was more rural and more of the disaffected farmers.
It's kind of like the spinning image of what we see today.
It really is. I mean, obviously different players, different dynamic. We're talking about a post-industrial world now versus a sort of a post-agriculture world then. But the parallels are amazing. when you really think about it historically. And when you look at what came out of that populist movement, for example, a series of amendments, the 17th Amendment, dealing with the issue of direct election of senators. We're having all this discussion about the Electoral College. I don't know that a constitutional amendment is likely, but certainly the rules that states abide by could start to change in terms of how we use that formula. That's just an example. And then, of course, the 18th Amendment comes in this context, and that's prohibition, which, of course, wasn't very successful. And then the 19th Amendment by 1920, giving women the right to vote. So it'll be interesting to see where this goes.
And so you said 63%, or that poll said 63% of people are dissatisfied with the direction America's going.
Right.
Is that a jarring number? Is that something people kind of are always dissatisfied with the direction things are going?
I think it fluctuates. I don't really know the history. That's a good question in terms of longitudinal perspective. But I think when you look at the statistics of, say, the European scenarios, ours is pretty moderate. Like I said, France is 89%, and you see in Austria, Germany, Italy. I think what it speaks to, more than anything, whether it's 50%, 60, or 80%, is I think it's part of the Western world's struggle with dealing with globalization. We're seeing the rise of these sort of radical right nationalist movements, and they're not all entirely xenophobic in nature or white supremacist in nature or anti-Semitic in nature, but a lot of these forces are just simply reacting out of personal concern about their financial situation, and some will lay blame and start pointing fingers. But this is clearly an ebb and flow statistic with who's winning and who's losing in the new formula of a post-industrial global economy where class structures are totally redefining themselves. They're no longer nationally defined, they're internationally defined.
And so you think this kind of draws upon like a fear of globalization, kind of like a unwillingness to...
Or a temperance of it, in a way, to slow it down, let's recalculate this, let's make sure everybody's coming along, because, hello, some of us are being forgotten in the equation. And that could get worse as this plays out. It's interesting when you look at this is another study from the, what's the source? It's an Ipsos Mori a study out of England, through The Economist magazine. It's China, Saudi Arabia, India, Argentina, Peru, Canada, and Russia. They all have the overwhelming sense that they're on the right track. Chinese, over 80%. So China, Saudi Arabia, India, Argentina, Peru, Canada, and Russia feel like they're on the right track. They're going in the right. Well, think about that. These are the countries that are improving, they're progressing in this new globalized economy.
Especially a country like China, where they were so secluded, and now they're kind of growing and globalizing and getting bigger and bigger.
And then when you look at the rest of the list, it's some of the more advanced industrial countries that are recalibrating because some of their resources are being shifted abroad. Some people are winning, some people are losing, and there's less satisfaction or less sense that the country's on the right track. And I just think we're seeing the equilibrium on a global scale more so than a national scale, unlike anything we've seen historically.
Some fascinating stuff, and we're going to continue this conversation, so don't go anywhere because there's more insights coming up. Welcome back to Insights. I'm joined by ACC Professor of Political Science Tim Kuhnlein, and we're just discussing the division in America. But it seems like most people kind of want to strive towards a bipartisanship in Washington and around the country.
Well, the studies are showing 8 in 10 want bipartisan solutions. And this sense of bipartisanship is less intense. The demand is less intense than what we saw back in 2008 when Obama was elected. And remember, those were highly contentious times. We had a financial collapse, and we also had 8 years of a pretty tumultuous realization of the Bush administration and what it represented. And there was a lot of anger. I mean, Bush kind of went out as one of the least popular presidents. The election of Obama then brought in the Affordable Care Act. It was sort of a glacial reaction in the midst of that financial crisis and so forth. So yeah, it's interesting to see where we are now, all this reaction to the Affordable Care Act and the sort of glacial shift in our politics. Counties and states going from Obama in the last 2 elections to a Trump vote this time. It's like the American people are trying to force the national structures and the party orientations to respond to them. And
it's kind of a reactionary,
yeah,
almost opposite shift from what they've seen in the past.
And it seems like from these studies that if you really stop and think about, and you listen to some of the messaging of the people who are, really trying to voice or articulate their support of Trump and what Trump has apparently honed in on, even though the Republicans and the Democrats didn't see it, is that people do, it appears as though we're very divided, and we are, but people want, they want solutions, I think, and they want it done in a way that we don't go in draconian directions in either direction. In other words, we need fixes for these problems because people are really struggling. And it comes back to the finances and all that stuff that are pretty dramatic right now.
And so let's talk about one of the main dividing factors right now is the idea of this Affordable Care Act, or what's monikered Obamacare.
Right.
What do you think? Why do you think there's so many people against it? Why do you think there's so many people for it?
Well, the reality is it didn't make it very affordable. And so in that sense, I think a lot of people are extremely frustrated. But the reality also is that most people want the fundamental components of it. It's just, it didn't do the task. And part of that is that, again, the partisanship played in. This was almost an entirely Democratic Party initiative in that reaction. The Republicans abstained, became almost obstinate in dealing with it because they didn't want another government program, even though Republicans created the largest expansion of a social welfare program with prescription or Medicare Part D and prescription medication for the elderly since the creation of Medicare. But here we have Obamacare. It's here to stay. Republicans, I think, have realized that it's not complete. They're never going to get rid of it entirely because it's actually the fundamentals of it are quite desirable. But finishing it is the story. Now, whether it'll become retitled Trump Care or whatever, let's remember the legislation was the Affordable Care Act, and in that sense, it's failed quite miserably. It has, however, brought some very important provisions for a lot of people, and it has expanded the number of people covered by health insurance, which for those of us that are covered by health insurance is a good thing because we don't have to pay their costs as much as when they don't contribute. If you just look at some of the things that people like, because I think it grounds the discussion. I mean, let's remember, this is a private insurance system still. This is not Medicare in the strictest sense. And even with Medicare, it's private oriented. Medicare recipients go to private insurers, right? The amount of money that went to hospitals to improve their infrastructure and their services, that's a huge boon. The coverage for up to 26-year-olds, that's a significant population.
For me, yeah.
Exactly. And I think we've all been in that situation. Right. The pre-existing conditions, of course, and also the lift on caps for chronic diseases that insurance companies would basically cut you off at a certain point. These are, even Trump is saying, these are all very positive outcomes, and even most Republicans.
I thought that was very interesting too, because the whole huge talking point was, well, we're going to get rid of Obamacare completely the first day, I'm going to sign it off. And then after he got elected, he was like, well, I took a look at it now. He's like, I kind of like some of the parts of it.
Well, and I think that when this first was introduced, Republicans, for the most part, didn't want any government involvement whatsoever. Well, it's a reality, it's there. And now the question is, okay, how do we make it work in a way that fits with their philosophical view and the practicalities, because there are practical problems with it. This is not a perfect piece of legislation. And one of the major shortcomings, of course, everybody's mad about the mandate, right? Nobody wants this sort of thing mandated, especially those who can't afford it. And the effect that it's having on small businesses and their bottom line, that's one of the problems that people are reacting to. The expansion of Medicaid has actually been, for the most part, a desirable thing. It's helping states cover the costs of their poor. And although when you look at it in cost of government, where's that money coming from? People start getting critical. Why should we pay for that? Why expand that? It's going to be a hard one to find a balance and equilibrium on. And then I think the other problem is the amount of money necessary to subsidize those who are in the low income or poor categories. Where does the money come from? We're obviously not elevating taxes enough to cover that or a lot of other things. So I think it's cost and choice are key things when we look at the problems. But at the center of this, and I think this is where Trump is onto something, is the interstate commerce. The fact that the original Affordable Care Act did not take into consideration the cross-state sale of insurance. Part of this is that insurance companies didn't want this competition. Right. And they lobbied heavily. And then when you look at the obstinance of the Republican Party, this became a Democratic initiative. They took what they could get, and there's something now. And the Republicans are almost forced now, and Trump, to take what's good, fix it, they'll rebrand it probably, and move forward, and mission accomplished, let's hope, because it's a serious problem, the affordability of healthcare in this country, even for those of us who have it. So this interstate commerce thing, I think, is a big issue.
All right, well, we're going to touch on that in a little bit, and we're going to continue this discussion of the Affordable Care Act, so don't go anywhere because there's more insights coming up after the break. Welcome back to this edition of Insights. I'm joined by ACC Professor of Political Science Tim Kuhnlein, and we're just discussing the Affordable Care Act. We're talking about how it's not really plausible for the Republicans in power to destroy the entire piece of legislation. So where do you think they're going to take it?
I don't think popular sentiment will allow it. The political repercussions would be grave. They're going to probably couch this in a way that they probably will dismantle it in terms of repealing it, but institutionalize something that looks very similar but is oriented towards their philosophical agenda, what's acceptable to them, and really does hopefully improve upon the ultimate goal, and that is making healthcare more affordable. The problem with that is, in order to do that, you have to start thinking about limitations, caps, and Medicare is the kind of the example of the problem that we're going to run into. The proposals coming from Tom Price and other Republicans are that, the Medicare problem requires an opt-out. Doctors want to opt out because they don't want to have to comply to the limitations that Medicare places on what they charge. Well, herein lies the problem. How do we control the inflation of the industry? And government setting price controls and all that stuff is maybe not the most desirable thing, but how else do we do this? Competition, okay, maybe. That's the insurance side of the equation, but the services side is another issue. So there's going to be some jockeying here. We've been given some indication now that we know who the Secretary of Health and Human Services secretary will be, Tom Price. You can kind of get a sense of the types of things that will probably be added to any new health reform legislation. They're talking a lot about age adjustments, using tax credits to sort of limit the amount of money that government has to put out to finance any program. But then the question becomes one of, well, is it enough for people to actually afford the service? Yeah. But at least it limits government's liability. Does it fix the problem? We'll see. HSAs, this is about discouraging use, fundamentally. And it can be somewhat effective in making people think twice about what they do to help curb costs. But again, if you don't have the money to put into the HSA, where's
You're basically not covered.
Right. And then grants, there's a lot of talk about block granting for states and certain populations so that we define a certain amount of money and that's it, and it subsidizes, but is it sufficient? And then doing that, particularly with high-risk pools, there's a lot of room probably in the existing legislation from all things considered to make some progress there. But again, it's all about how much money is available and does it really help the population. There's talk about association plans for business and professional groups to do group policies and things of that sort. Probably legislation related to medical malpractice, loosening up those obligations, or liabilities for medical personnel, doctors, and so forth. So, you know, these are just some indications of what could be added, well, this on top of allowing for the sale of insurance across state boundaries, which would create a level of competition.
I think that's probably the biggest thing they're going to focus on is opening up that competition.
Yeah, Trump, that's what he highlights.
Right, and that will, you know, lower the premium costs, I guess, for the recipients of it.
Yeah, and then, you know, Trump has also been pretty forthright about protecting Medicare. So how these two discussions, the Affordable Care Act for non-Medicare and the revisions of Medicare, how that all relates to one another, they're kind of a mirror image. And of course, others are suggesting we should just have a single-payer system or a system that is an expansion of Medicare for everyone, so that you can manage it.
So not just seniors, but have kind of that same idea for system for the general public.
Right.
But that would kind of limit that would have no competition in that case.
It depends on how it would be structured, of course. According to the current model, right, you have one insurer essentially, but you have access to private services. But then, see, that's where the other side of the aisle argues, well, but there are price limits, and doctors don't necessarily want to comply with that. Their costs are higher. And this is the crux of the problem. How do we manage all of this and control the inflation of an industry that is probably one of the most inflated industries in our economy?
And so when we have, you know, one party controlling every aspect of government in Washington starting in January, are they able to basically do whatever they want with something like this?
No, because any change to this law, of course, will require an ability in the Senate to stop a filibuster. So the Republicans will need a 60 vote total to essentially stop the legislation from being stalled that would come out of the House, for example, and before it ever reaches the president. And then the president could always put pressure back on. So in some respects, the one-party directive of this could actually help winnow out a clarification, much like the creation of the initial legislation was done by one party. I just hope, and I think many among me hope that that the other side of the aisle will be heard, and that we won't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We can find a more workable solution to the core problem, and that is affordability for a greater number of people.
And it's going to be interesting to see what happens, obviously, with, you know, Trump taking over and kind of looking to improve upon what's called Obamacare and maybe make it his own.
Right. And maybe we can get away from the proper names.
Sounds good. Thank you, Tim. And thank you for joining us. There's going to be more insights next week at the same time, same place, so stay tuned.
Insights into Northeast Michigan is produced by WBKB News. If you have any comments, suggestions, or topics you would like to see on a future show, please email WBKB News. This has been a production of Thunder Bay Broadcasting Corporation. All rights reserved.